Hello.
Hey, Allison, how are you tonight?
I'm doing well. How are you, David?
Good, good. You're in New York and I am in San Antonio, Texas.
Yes, we are. What a time to be alive.
It is a good time to be alive. Happy days are here again.
Yeah. All right. Well, how about we get started tonight's David, do you want to introduce yourself a bit and also the
Okay,
topic?
okay. I'm David Johnson. I am a lifelong, or I should say career-long educator, and my particular interest is social justice. And what social justice means is that I'd like to ensure that opportunities are available to young people like they were to me when I was a young person. And I consider myself a flourishing beneficiary of education, so I want to make sure educational opportunities are available to young people. The last time we met, we spoke about the digital divide. And this topic still is about the digital divide, except from a different perspective, from the perspective of special needs students, students with special needs. Now, the same things that affected low-income students or students in rural areas regarding the digital divide also affect students with special needs, but then there's an added challenge that such students face.
Absolutely. I think what we're finding a lot right now is that obviously a lot of these gaps in education already existed, but they've been absolutely exacerbated in ways that really no one could have anticipated in the virtual scale. And while they were there in school, it's proliferated into something just so much bigger. So
Absolutely.
I'm very glad that we're really addressing specifically the needs of students that are learning virtually, that have IEPs, 504 plans, very, very important.
Absolutely. Thank you, Allison.
Yeah. All right, here, I will share your slide. So
Good.
And then, of course, if people have questions, we love questions. And there's so much. David is a wealth of knowledge, and just we are blessed to have him here today. So
Allison, you flatter me. We actually work very well together. We've completed some good work together, and I look forward to more work. So you can see from my slide, I have two columns or two areas. One is called what is, and that's where we currently stand, and then what parents can do. So you might say that this presentation and these list of topics are aimed most at parents. So if you are a parent or if you are an educator yourself, please take notes perhaps and share what you've learned with the parents with whom you work.
Absolutely. I think we really need to hone in on what can be done rather than what, I think there's this liminal space between what people need and what people really want to do to go above and beyond. So really hanging on to and controlling what we can control as a parent, as an educator that is, teaching students with disabilities, anything that we can do in the moment will pay off years down the line when, hopefully we are back in school.
Well, let's start with what is. The first bullet. School districts must provide a free and appropriate public education to disabled children in the least restrictive environment under IDEA. Now, I'm sure everyone knows this already. I use this bullet as a way to open up the conversation, as a way to introduce the topics that we will discuss, because, of course, it has a dramatic effect on everything that occurs with disabled students.
Yeah, absolutely. I think perhaps a common misconception as well is just the complete concept of a monolithic students with disabilities group. We talk a lot about students with disabilities and group them into this one topic and one conversation, but there's so much diversity of,
Mhm.
you know, of diagnosis
Mhm.
in the students with disability space.
Mhm.
So, guaranteeing free, appropriate public education is going to look very different for students that, have dyslexia versus autism.
Mhm.
Um, so,
Absolutely.
mhm.
So let's look at this next one. SPED students need reasonable accommodations and support from professionals such as specialized teachers, educators, and psychologists.
Mhm. And I think the collaboration part is actually very key to me in this bullet point. It's not just about, oh, well, I'm the teacher and, I'm teaching the student and this is my responsibility. No, it's about collaboration, especially now where, your parents are now very much a part of the classroom. They're in the home with your student. And, of course, you have paraprofessionals, psychologists, all the specialized teachers. And it's about collaborating, which is really the name of the game, especially during virtual learning for students with disabilities.
Well, one of the reasons this particular bullet or point is so important is that it allows for equity. And again, as a social justice warrior, one of my main concerns is equity. And equity is different than is equality. I always think of it as equality is when you're going in the door. For example, we'll say equal opportunity. Yes, you have an equal opportunity to walk into this door. But then I call equity where you are after you've left that building, let's say. Have you had the same sort of successes, equitable accomplishments as everyone around you? And many times, particularly with students with special needs, the outcome is not as equitable as it is for general ed students.
Absolutely. It's really important, I think, to, especially right now, pay attention to the outcomes, uh, just as much as, what services are students receiving now, but also how are they doing.
Right.
And one thing I'm particularly concerned about, especially in relation to students with disabilities, is that we're starting to see very preliminary data that students aren't doing well, but a lot of those exams actually don't include students with disabilities.
Right.
They've either been opted out or can't take it due to, other confounding factors like the
Mm-hmm.
inability to have access to Wi-Fi. And so
Yep.
we don't even know how these students are really doing yet, which is very, very concerning. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna put this on the banner because yes, special education teachers do need help, and collaboration is the key.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for, you know,
There are a couple of
validating that.
key words in this one bullet that sort of answer the why the bullet is important. And a key word is reasonable. Reasonable. And you've heard court cases where they talk about the reasonable person would assume this or the reasonable person would assume that. That's somewhat how this works as well. It's almost as if you're asking, well, what makes sense in this particular case? If a student can't see the board, is it reasonable to move that student up in the classroom? Of course it is. If a student can't hear what is being said, is it reasonable to allow the student to use assistive technology? Of course it is. So in many respects, reasonable is the application of common sense.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Well, shall we go to the next bullet?
I think so.
All right. The pandemic upended facets of schooling. The U.S. Department of Education stressed all public schools educating during the pandemic must also serve students with disabilities. If you take a moment and remember back in February and March when the pandemic first arrived, it didn't just first arrive, when it exploded, I guess you might say. In many respects, we were ignorant and did not know how widespread it would be and how much it would affect what we do every day, including schools. And another key word in here is facets. There are many facets involved in education. I mean, you got buses, you've got individual classes, you've got counselors, you've got nurses, you've got sports, you've got special education, you've got the dining rooms. There are so many parts involved in education. And when the pandemic first struck, we didn't know just how widespread it would be. In fact, I recall that some believed that it might be just 2 weeks, that everything would go back to normal after spring break. But surprisingly, it did not. But as a result, it caught school districts off guard. And it led to the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education, making a statement that if schools are open and having general ed students learn remotely, then the same sort of services that general ed students receive must also be granted to students with disabilities.
Yeah, and I think one thing that really struck me at this point in time is the broad statement that yes, we do need to continue serving students with disabilities, but the conversation had just begun. What does that look like for students who are really in critical need of one-to-one services? Maybe it works better in person. How do you translate that into a virtual reality?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, of course, we're still figuring that out.
Mm-hmm.
But reasserting that we need to serve students with disabilities doesn't clarify, especially at that juncture when all students all of a sudden, weren't in school, had to adjust to the new normal of virtual schooling. It didn't start that conversation. It just, it almost circumvented it, which I thought was interesting.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good point. In fact, I think the next bullet talks about that. Services are not easily distance transferable, not even possible, nor even possible with social distancing, with the one-on-one therapies, for example. And your point is well taken. You don't just simply transfer all of the services that special education students receive. You cannot just simply transfer that to remote e-learning or distance learning. You can't reach through a computer. You can't reach through the internet to provide physical therapy. You can't reach through an assistive device, or if a student doesn't have an assistive device, how do you provide services to that student? And the way computers are built, we give all these computers and other technical assets to children to learn at home. But suppose the student requires accommodation to improve vision. Suppose the student requires accommodation to have access to a mouse, to be able to use a mouse. Those things don't just simply transfer when you have students with special needs at home trying to learn from a distance.
Absolutely. This is where I think we also have to acknowledge that teachers, the word educator in relation to students with disabilities is so broad. You'll have a teacher that has 23 other students in their classroom and then one student that has an IEP, or maybe they're a one-to-one teacher. They might be a resource center teacher, or maybe they're like a speech pathologist. And so I think that classroom setting, whether, maybe you are one-to-one, or maybe you have 23 other papers you have to grade, and then your 24th student is on an IEP and you also have to consider them. So, I do really want to applaud teachers. I see a lot of teachers really trying to figure out, well, what can I do creatively to support my student with disability at this time? But, again, I think we also have to acknowledge that there is, in some cases, a very inherent limitation that some of these services really do not translate well to the online reality.
Mm-hmm. And in this particular digital divide, parents have reported that their children have regressed. They've lost milestones and various abilities that they had worked for months or years to achieve. So they've gone backward as a result of so-called remote learning and the inaccessibility of the supports that special ed students need.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think, once again, though, I think that there are actionable things that we can do right now that might not completely eradicate the problem, but mitigates the academic slipping. It mitigates the isolation, even. There are absolutely steps that we can take.
Yes, parents have expressed concern about the social isolation, particularly for their special education needs or high needs students.
So
Now,
what can
this last
parents
bullet
do?
here, districts
Okay.
lack funds to accommodate disabled students. That's sort of a double-edged sword. Because of the pandemic and having to revert to remote learning and then hybrid learning, all of these things cost money. and there's sort of a double-edged sword. At first, school districts tried to get waivers for having to meet IEPs. With the waiver, however, they would not receive the kinds of support that they would normally receive. So that's one loss of funding. The other effect on funding is that money has been diverted to support other aspects that result from the pandemic. For example, because students are at home, they're driving buses to areas to provide food for students. And at the same time, because the students are not in school and not completing the school lunch program forms, schools are not being reimbursed for those expenses. And there are a lot of new expenses as a result of the pandemic that also affect how students with special needs receive services.
Absolutely. And I'd also add, looking ahead, that there are a lot of schools that are facing budget cuts in the next year.
Right.
Things that, because right now we're so focused on the immediate. In the long term, it's really only going to be a long a long road for school funding.
So let's talk about what parents can do.
Absolutely.
Perhaps the first and main thing is maintain weekly contact with the school district and the IEP coordinator and or team in writing. And why would writing be emphasized here, Allison? What's your thought on that?
Always, always, always keep a record of what you are saying between the school and, especially in the context of services, the IEPs, very, very important to make sure you always have it in writing.
Yeah. And request guidance when needed. How would this fit, Allison?
Ooh, we have a question first. What does it mean when you say they apply for waivers and therefore they get less funding? So he's not familiar with the process.
So, of course, so much is dependent on the kind of funding support we get from the federal government as well as state governments. And if students are not listed as special education, then that's a funding stream that's lost, So there was a lot of pressure and still a lot of pressure on school districts and particular superintendents on getting paperwork filed and having all of the timelines met regarding when to meet and when to evaluate students with special needs.
Exactly. And that also gets into why you always get everything in writing. I've heard there's very preliminary data actually that's showing that there's a lot of students that are being taken off of IEP services. And often they'll say, oh, well, they've tested out, or always get it in writing. Parents just keeping that conversation, that line of communication open with the school, you're already 5-6 steps ahead because you know what's going on.
Right.
So it's very important.
Now, this other part, request guidance when needed. Of course, parents are not the experts, are not necessarily trained to the same level that professionals who work with special needs students on a regular basis. So, of course, if you run into some sort of issue with a child, request request help, request assistance, request advice from the experts.
Absolutely. And I love this framing, because I think a lot of parents or I guess I'd say there's, especially in relation to students with disabilities, there's this real us versus them mentality, but we're really all on the same team. You know, we're all very passionate about students getting the right education, getting equitable education.
Yeah.
So really recognizing and taking a step back and thinking, you know, we're all on the same team. Maybe that my students' education isn't up to the par that I think it should be right now. I'm going to reach out to the teacher and be proactive about that.
Yep.
You know, recognizing we're all on the same team and we can all contribute to our child's education.
So Allison, related to what you said earlier, collect and report student data exactingly. Include video, schoolwork, and other documentation to track student progress or regression. Now, how would this be useful in regression?
Very useful. Regression, the data analyst myself, very, very useful. In terms of, you know, we have very preliminary data for students who don't have disabilities. And I'd even add, you know, yes, regression is great, but qualitative data, that video, perhaps that one quote from your student, that qualitative data as well is going to be so helpful, not only for your teachers now, but for your teacher next year who's evaluating, okay, well, you know, where is my student right now? Where do we need to start? So collecting all of that data now, and data feels even so formal, just collecting all of that schoolwork. You know, take a video of your student articulating, you know, speaking out loud. You know, pick up some of their writing that was graded and say, I'm going to keep this and look it over. You know,
now,
those samples.
This next bullet has a number of keywords in it. Reevaluate, consider, contingent IEP. So let's look at reevaluate. So the setting has changed. If all of the schoolwork the student is engaging is at home, then it requires a reevaluation. The services, the learning goals that may have been appropriate for the school may not apply when the learning is taking place at home. Now, consider a contingent. Ironically and oddly, some schools, even though they're having students remain at home, are having special education students come to school a couple of times during the week to provide services. But if things change, like New York City, for example, where the mayor closed down the schools or sent everyone home for remote learning, that's a contingency that must be included in the IEP. So when it's one set, you can come to school a couple of times per week. If things change, then you've got to make arrangements to provide support for a student learning at home. So that would be a contingent IEP. Absolutely. And likewise, the IEP team and the parents should adjust goals to those that would be achievable in a home environment, and ensure that the IEP includes assistive devices that a parent can take home and use when working with his or her child. Absolutely. That sort of planning and almost flexibility is something I'd like to see come out of this experience for students, specifically students with disabilities, their parents. I'd like to see that kind of planning. That's the goal. Right, that's the dream. Even just requesting. And here we see establish an agreement for when an in-person service can resume if it is not available now. We spoke earlier about all the kinds of services that special ed students would need, and they would receive if they were in the school every day. Unfortunately, those kinds of services from professionals don't necessarily come home with them. In fact, some school districts have liability rules that prevent professionals from visiting parents in their homes or providing services to students in their home. So that's an important agreement that a parent must make with the school district to resume those services when students are back in school. Absolutely. And I'll always reiterate, just like the first bullet point, in writing and writing in writing. Writing is accountability. Now, here's a new term I learned: universal design for learning. We always use the term differentiated instruction. And universal design for learning seems to be the same in that it ensures that learning is designed for specific students and not treating students, as a word you used earlier, as a monolith. Not all students learn the same. We have different strengths. We have different ways of learning, ways of knowing, and a universal design would ensure that all those different ways of learning and knowing are addressed.
What I love about this bullet point is that it's so transferable. You know, you can, for instance, you know, if you have a student with dyslexia and you're having students write out a book report, maybe you could have that student do it as a video. You know, students perform well in different capacities because every student has different strengths. So even for educators and for parents, you know, maybe reframing a homework as a board game, or, you know, maybe you're learning math and you're learning measurements and you can have your student help cook in the kitchen with you. And just reframing it. And that's UDL at its heart. That's UDL. So just
and parents should request intensive services if evidence indicates students have regressed since days when the pandemic closed schools. So it's a way of keeping track to ensure the student receives the necessary services, that the outcome will be equitable.
Absolutely. And this is where collecting student work, taking videos, that's going to come in helpful. You know, all documentation, that's always the name of the game.
And then our last bullet, I have worked with parents of students with special needs, and they are very, very active and engaged people. And so active and engaged that they will go out and get the type of evidence they need from professionals to support the requests that they make to the schools for services for their children. So seek and report specific recommendations from private clinicians based on their general experience.
Absolutely. You know, if the means are available, it can only help.
So Allison, that's everything I have to say. I did create a document that Cassandra will post, and in that document are links to all the various organizations that provide support to parents with children with special needs. And I hope that you all find that document and download it and benefit from it. I believe it's very useful. It will lead you to places that will help you think about how best to serve your students and how best to work with school districts.
Absolutely. You know, resources are always a great thing to get. It can only help.
So we're at the end. So closing statements. Allison, how would you close this, and what's your main takeaway?
My main takeaway is that there are very easy, I hesitate to say easy, they're very actionable steps that parents and educators can take right now to mitigate the academic and social slipping that is happening for students with disabilities. And being proactive is not just about talking about, I'm glad that we're doing this, but it's also about action. And there are, you know, just as simple as reaching out to a teacher, redesigning a lesson and being mindful of the students in your classroom if you are an educator, reframing it for your student if you're a parent. These are things we can do now. And I know, right, like I get so caught up in the, oh my gosh, the world is the world and what are we going to do and everything is happening, but there are things we can do now. So that's my takeaway, is that there are things we can and should do now.
Okay. Well, thank you, Allison, for having me. I enjoy these conversations very much. And of course, our purpose is to ensure opportunities are available to students and that there are equitable outcomes.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for being here. And thank you for everyone for watching. Yeah.
Whew.